glasses, there's 2 weeks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for coming, and I particularly thank the European Union for allowing us to use this space. The first thing I'd like to say, my name is Kaveh Galimpo. I'm the Vice President of International Strategies at the Center of Climate and Energy Solutions. And what we're going to be talking today is the global stocktake and a vision for accelerating the transition to net zero. At the outset, I'd like to say this is a silent meeting. So if people have questions, they should scan the Slido QR code, which we'll put up on the screen at the moment. So you should pose any questions you have via the Slido, which will be put on the screen. I would also say that we are joined with 4 really excellent panelists, which I'll introduce as we go along. But we're going to start, first of all, with Juliana. So essentially, the project that we've been working on at CTUS is looking at the global stocktake and trying to understand how it can add value in terms of raising both ambition and implementation. And the main messages that we've come out with in this project is that the global stocktake, which is due to, after 2 years, conclude in just a few days' time, needs to send very clear and actionable signals to the outside world and to stakeholders as to what is expected in terms of raising the level of ambition, but also implementation. But also, importantly, the global stocktake needs to send a really clear message to all of the many tens of thousands of people that are coming to COP28 and the people outside, what is expected of them in 2024 to take forward the outcomes of COP28 and make it into reality. And in that respect, we're probably going to focus our conversation in particular on the energy transition towards net zero. And coming into COP28, there's a lot of momentum around this idea of tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030, doubling energy efficiency. Almost 120 countries, I think, by this point have signed a pledge to that effect. Of course, also in play is this notion of potentially sending a signal on phasing out or phasing down unabated fossil fuels. So all of these things are going to be very much the subject of discussions at ministerial level as we go into the second week. But we've got a great panel to discuss what that might look like in terms of some of the details for that. And I'd first like to turn to Juliana Arciniegas, who's with Transforma, is a very old friend of mine, a former lead negotiator of Colombia. So Juli, looking at you, in terms of our work, it would be really interesting to hear how we can move from incremental progress that we've had from past COPs towards transformational level of progress. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kaveh. Hello to everyone. Perhaps for context of the audience, Transforma is a Latin American think tank that works on climate change and ecological transitions. And as Kaveh mentioned, together with C2ES, EDF, and some other organizations and experts on this process, we've been thinking already for 2 years on what could be that transformational change and what could be this ideal outcome of the global stocktake and COP28. And particularly, Transforma has been identifying from the developing countries' perspective what are those needs and what are those priorities that needs to be adopted at this COP. So why is this year so important? I think it's pretty evident. This is the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement, something that we imagined when we were negotiating Paris as the moment to really assess our progress and define the actions for the next years. And I think that science and especially the IPCC has been very clear. We only have 6 years to cut the emissions to halve. Then we have to reduce the emissions in 60% in 2035, and then by the end of 2000, like in the end of the century, we'll of course achieve carbon neutrality. But at the same time, science has presented very clear alarms in terms of adaptation. We are not adapting ourselves as we should. There has been progress in terms of planning, in terms of formulation of instruments, but not in terms of the implementation as we should be doing. And of course, this has also impacts in terms of the losses and damages that we are already experiencing in the world. So this is the opportunity to correct that course of action, the trajectories of the emissions. And of course, what we've been thinking in the context of this project is that in order to achieve those transformational changes, not incremental effort, but transformational changes, we need to send very clear signals to the outside world, not only to governments, but also to non-state actors, to the private sector, or on what can be done. Because science has also identified the solutions that can be already implemented, that are feasible, that have high impacts in different regions of the world. So there is a lot of input also on those opportunities that we have. And there are many coalitions and there are many initiatives that are already working on this. So it's not that we're just designing something entirely new here. We have a lot of good information, and the GST process has sort of mapped all this process for us to take decisions at this COP. So let me just mention some of these issues and signals where we expect a concrete outcome at COP28. Of course, you said, Cabe, energy transition is one of the main topics of these negotiations. And for developing countries, energy transition is not only about agreeing or adopting a target on tripling renewable energies, but this is also related to what are we going to do with the phase out of the fossil fuels. What are we going to do with the subsidies that go to current fossil fuels as well? How are we going to implement these targets in terms of the finance and the support that developing countries will be needing, and how are we going to put nature and people at the center of this conversation to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past in terms of extractivism and other practices that led to inequalities and many other problems. So this is one part, of course, and in the context of this project, we have been identifying also the barriers and the opportunities of addressing this issue of energy transition, but let me just mention a few others on where we see there are transformational opportunities. On adaptation, I think some of you may have heard that in this COP, we're expecting to adopt the framework of the Global Goal on Adaptation to be able to measure what this goal means actually for our countries. But there are specific sectors and systems where we see that adaptation has big opportunities. For example, in terms of biodiversity, what is these linkages with the nature agenda? How do we connect the processes of the Biodiversity Convention, the certification conventions, the Sustainable Development Agenda? How do we move beyond the silos and really see these connections as an opportunity, but also in terms of agriculture, not only from the production, but also from the consumption side. Land use sector is one of the biggest emitters in the world, so we see here important opportunities. Of course, finance for adaptation is a key priority for developing countries, and there are already commitments from developed countries to double finance on adaptation. Of course, loss and damage, we have seen some progress in terms of the fund that I think are positive, but still in the context of the global stocktake, we need to see the political commitment to go beyond the existing commitments and arrangements and really make sure that we make them operational and that we provide the required support for the most vulnerable communities in the world. And finally, in terms of means of implementation, I think this is one of the most complex packages and areas of the work and the negotiations. It's always the most difficult things to really get to a decision. And here we definitely expect different things. On the one hand, as I mentioned, that the targets that we adopt, for example, in energy transition, be accompanied with the specific support for their implementation, but also the accomplishment of previous existing commitments, like the commitment on the 100 billion. Of course, the needs today are estimated in trillions to 2030, so we need to start recognizing that and moving in that direction and reading from developed countries also that there is a commitment to move in that direction, but we are also conscious that the Paris Agreement demands for an alignment of all financial flows from the private sector, from all levels of different stakeholders. So we need definitely to see multilateral development system and the whole financial architecture to be reformed to respond to the demands of Paris. We need to see the private sector presenting all the information and committing, with all the transparency to climate action. We need to address the debt crisis of developing countries. I think that it's very clear that the fiscal space for developing countries is very limited in this moment to address climate change, and that if we don't address those gaps, it will be very difficult to face the increasing impacts of climate change. So it's rather a very broad package that we're expecting here at this COP, and of course next year is the negotiation and the adoption of the new collective goal on finance that is of course connected to this process, but of course the GST has to send very specific and concrete signals on all these issues for its follow-up in 2024. So here I come to the second question in terms of what we expect for next year is a concrete response from the international community on what we adopt at COP24. This will be the main input for the update of NDCs, but it can be also an input for adaptation communications, for long-term strategies, for all climate action. And as I'm sure other speakers will address, how this also will be critical to enhance international cooperation. So I will leave it here just as to present some expectations for next year, and maybe we can come back to other issues.
Thanks, Julie. I think it was a good reminder, again, of the sort of theory of change of the work that we've been doing, this notion of clear signals coming out of Dubai, but also the importance of follow-up. And usefully, you also reminded us that, of course, it's not only about the energy transition. The global stocktake is also about adaptation, means of implementation. But I think drilling down a little bit more into that just energy transition, given of where we are in this part of the world and the momentum coming into the COP around the tripling of renewables and the energy efficiency, I'd like now to turn to Marta Torres Gunfaus, who's the Senior Researcher on Climate and Energy and National Engagements Lead of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative at IDRI, which has been doing really fantastic work. So Marta, I'd really like to turn to you to maybe drill down a little bit more into this notion of the tripling of renewable energy capacity. This has been consistently in the vision of the COP28 presidency in the letters that Dr. Sultan has published in the lead up to the COP. There's been a lot of momentum in ministerial discussions, both during Climate Week and also the pre-COP, and now we have something like 120 countries that have signed this declaration towards tripling of renewables. I'm just wondering, what do you think we need to see coming out of the global stocktake that would drive the enhanced cooperation that's necessary to turn those words on paper into reality? So Marta, tiene la palabra.
Thanks very much. Yes, no, thanks very much, Kaveh, and thanks, of course, for this collaboration with C2ES, with you and Jenny and the team to organize this. And I will directly go into the. I will not directly go into your question, but I'm gonna say why. As you said, so I'm at IDRI, and I'm the National Engagement Lead of this DDP. And the DDP, which is this Deep Decarbonization Pathway, that's not my slide. Sorry. Okay. You will, okay, we'll pass it. But basically, I want to explain why is it important, like what we're explaining here, is because what we do at DDP, this is a network of national and international, I'm not touching, I promise. It's a network of national and international experts in more than 20 countries. And what we do is at country level, do the studies to see what are the type of pathways and the type of conditions that will allow us to meet both development and climate goals at national level. And this is all done with experts. You have here 2 leads no, for Brazil and for China. We have these in more than 20 countries. And basically, it's this kind of bottom-up studies that the Paris Agreement was asking for, right? So what are at country level, and not just the analysis that we can do with our models, but also understanding what is actually, the real policy environment, what the stakeholders say about it, what is politically feasible, etc. So based on this robust analysis that we do at country level, and those are country-led, country-driven projects, what we do as a network then is trying to understand, okay, what's coming from the bottom up, how can, then bring these into the international processes, right, to make sure that we have the right conditions to make sure that countries can go further, that can move into action in a smooth manner. So what we're trying is to generate those cross-country messages on what are those enabling conditions that somehow are outside the control of the countries themselves. And this brings us to the question on the GST today. There are very strong conclusions in each of the countries. There are so many assumptions that we have, and not just in the model, but in the mind of all those stakeholders that have to validate the credibility of those pathways on what will happen outside. And that they know that there are certain things that if others are not actioning it, we will not be able to do it at country level. And that what we see, there's no country, and Deng Fei will corroborate, not even China, right, that can do this alone, can reach the 1.5 alone. So that can reach full decarbonization alone. So we have to work together. That's one of the main conclusions. And then going to the GST and the COP, I mean, the result that we see from the technical dialogue over those 2 years, as you were saying, is that basically it states the same. There are some international conditions that are necessary, and they're not yet in place. Or let's say, the way we're working together, the way cooperation is working, it's not as effective as it should be to be able to reach the goals. So we need to innovate international cooperation. This is a result from the GST. And then we ask ourselves, okay, so from all the work at country level, what is this innovation? Why is it not working? Why are we not working better together in a way that then countries can see more potential going further or being more ambitious? So we try to put this into this report, some ideas that basically, as Kaveh was saying, is we really need starting from now and from, if you want, 1st of January 2024, to make sure that there are more places where countries can discuss together, and not just countries, let's say, the delegations, but also the implementers, where they can discuss with other countries on how to move together into specific challenges. Maybe at sector level, maybe at finance level, but basically making sure that there are those places where I can see how, as a country, can I go further if I collaborate with others, and to be able to explain what are my circumstances and my specific things that are unlocking, going further. So in this report, you will see 3 examples that we go on: steel sector, on freight transport, and on a follow. But what about the energy? Because you were asking. So what about the? So partly, we didn't choose it here as a specific point, but my colleagues, I'm sure, will talk a lot about the energy transition. But the essence is also about this, is about we cannot, so both those global benchmarks, they need to come along with some changes in the international cooperation environment. Some of those directly relate to what Juliana was already saying about the reform of MDBs to have access to low cost, for the capital investments, et cetera. But there's also many more things that go into other sectors if you try to size what is the demand of this energy system that we are trying to shape. And many of the discussions we can have at the sectors will give us this information both at international level and national level on what is the size of that energy demand, and why how we can control it also to make sure that the transition is also more manageable and more possible, and we can go further, no? And just to give an example, depending on how steel is being discussed at global level and depending on the strategy, how it is being decarbonized globally, that has impact on how the value chain will be arranged. So it has a lot of impact on the energy that Brazil or China or South Africa or the EU has to produce, no? Or the power that they have to produce. And these informations directly inform what really needs to happen on the ground, and those type of decisions, no? Then the governments are asking, no, the experts to answer. So directly into the changes that are needed. The conclusion from the bottom-up analysis is it's still international cooperation is not yet, it's not properly reflecting the needs of the countries. Typically, still, many of the solutions are defined in a rather top-down manner. And that it's not a bad faith necessarily, it just, or not at all, but it's also the capacity that each of the countries have to be able to engage in the design of those solutions. The capacity that they have to distill what do I need from the others, no? Which needs having the capacity to bring together my stakeholders, to define my long-term strategies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it is really, we really have to put, just say needs-based, but knowing that very much this comes with a much stronger support on building national capacities, no? And otherwise will not happen. So sector-driven, and why? Because many of the solutions really need to engage whole communities, and communities usually engage in sectoral systems, no? That's how implementers also work, and that's how then it's possible to go into more details and know exactly, so okay, other than the maybe billions, no, that we may need to finance the long-term strategy, but exactly how much money do I need to move that little step in that specific sector, no? And be able then to also put those conditions forward when discussing then, for example, GST deals or others. Forward-looking, just because indeed, as Juliana was saying, in order to avoid these incremental changes, we really need the transformations to have a long-term view, meaning I know that I'm doing this now because that's what I need to be in 2050 or in 2060, wherever I have to be. And we still see many of the international cooperation activities or thinking very much into kind of a forward-looking, but in an incremental manner, because we lacked kind of those benchmarks on where each of these sectoral systems should be at country level in different time horizons. And yeah, solutions-oriented is also because, yeah, international cooperation indeed is discussed a lot here, but it's true that usually we, within the UNFCCC, we tend to see it probably in a more siloed approach. And here, when we talk about international cooperation, is okay, creating markets for green commodities, reforming MDBs, changing the trading rules. Like this really involves many more people. And probably within the UNFCCC, we cannot do that, but what can it do? So that's the next. We really think that within the UNFCCC, there is that role of creating these bridges, if you want, with all these other actors. And if COP28 wants to, as we're saying, just tapping into that implementation gap, but also being able to put the conditions for countries to submit more ambitious NDCs by 2025, really we have to send the signal that we're going to work differently together, that we're going to have this system over 2024 to really look at what is not working exactly and how we can respond to those country needs. So this is both the political signal, but also that process over 2024, maybe ending with a dialogue. I don't know, but the experts here will define, but the thing is we really need to create the space for us to also discuss how we organize ourselves at the international level for countries to be able to deliver on higher ambition and action. With this, I'll leave it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Marta. And for anyone who hasn't read it, I really encourage them to read the DDP IDRI report, because it's full of really good information. I wonder if we could also put the Slido QR code back on the screen. If people have questions, please do submit them. I need someone to get this on the right screen again. But two things that really came through to me from what you were saying. One is that no country can do this on their own. And as you said, the mandate of the Global Stocktake isn't only about informing enhanced ambition, it's also enhanced international cooperation. We've never really defined that, and I think you set out very clearly there. But the other thing that made me smile when you were speaking is these things that the Global Stocktake needs to do so that the UNFCCC can speak to the real world. And Juliana and I have spent half the day today sat in the negotiating room, and it's a parallel universe. This is the real conversation. That one is still very abstract. So we've still got a few days left to bring the two worlds together, but really thinking about how this forum can send signals to stakeholders is going to be really important. But we'll see. So I don't have any further questions. If you do have questions, if you could please submit them through the QR code, and I think also online you have that chance. I'd now like to turn to Professor Emilio Levre La Rovere, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who's joining us from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. You're very welcome, and of course, Brazil is going to have a very important role to play, probably in the next 2 years, to land all of the ambition that we're hoping to generate here. But I'd really like you to maybe share some of the thoughts you've heard so far from our speakers. So it's over to you, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Before addressing the energy transition, I think that the lessons of the global stocktake are very clear, and there is a huge gap in terms of implementation of real action on the ground compared to the level of ambition. This is no surprise, of course, for us. But I think that what we are going maybe to say about the energy transition also could apply to adaptation, to loss and damage, to forests, to biodiversity. So I think these dimensions should also be present in our mind. And I think what we need as good outcomes from this COP in order to follow up next year on the GST is much alike the pathway of the negotiations themselves, that we widen the scope and the metrics and the indicators that we track. It's very clear that this convention, it was first something about scientific people, diplomats, and now we have contingents from the oil and gas industry, for instance, that are impressive. So we are doing our homework in actually tracking the emission gaps, and we've been doing that consistently. But what about the drivers of these emissions? And that's where maybe we could go and widen this scope of the metrics and the indicators, because that points to the action and the implementation needed on the ground. So I would think that after talking about the emission gaps, we will also look to the duo of the problem, which are, for instance, carbon prices. And looking to carbon prices in the global stocktake we assume that we first have to talk, before talking about phasing out fossil fuels, we should talk about phasing out subsidies to fossil fuel prices. And this has been doing consistently an annual base in every International Monetary Fund report, we can read that recommendation. So I think that also from the climate perspective, we should go along that lines, but disaggregating, because there is a caveat. Subsidies can be justified on social grounds. The transition must be just. So one thing is, of course, subsidies to coal. Another thing is subsidies to oil supply. We don't need them anymore. Maybe for some niches of oil consumption in, say, before electricity-based induction cookstoves can be affordable. Maybe the developing world will need liquefied petroleum gas for some time, and will need to subsidize for some time. But we need to know more about how much and for how long we are going to do that. And the transparency about fossil fuel subsidies is very difficult. Also, the definition is not easy, but we can use some internationally accepted definitions. So I think we should also report and track on those, and also for natural gas. Of course, natural gas can be a transition fuel in many economies, in many contexts, and we need to build the infrastructure on natural gas for the transition. But we also have to do that, as Marta was saying, based on our backcasting approach of our analysis, to avoid any lock-in also in natural gas. That means that if we are planning to replace natural gas eventually in the future with green hydrogen, okay, but we should also avoid lock-in in natural gas as well. And these different fossil fuels, we must find a language to distinguish them, because the contexts are very difficult, very different, and now we have made some progress in terms of coal. The financial sector sees investments in coal with some now fear, but oil will follow suit, but later, and so on. So I think this kind of indicators is needed, and to have monitoring, report, and verification in future global stock takes as well. And then come to carbon pricing policies. That is the following step after phasing out subsidies. And here I think it's very important to ensure acceptability, social acceptability, political acceptability of carbon pricing. And we should focus also on these complementary public policies that actually allow for carbon pricing to be acceptable. We can refer, for instance, to a number of examples provided in Stiglitz-Stern report of the high-level Commission on Carbon Pricing. We have indicators to track also on that. And third point on finance, of course. We've seen now this year, finally, statistics of climate finance going beyond $1 trillion per year, roughly 1.2. But this is still, of course, needs to be tripled or at least. But there is also the need for targets and timetabling for increasing this ambition, of course, but also the modalities of access and how to speed up and make this money flow through the financial institutions up to the end user. We can make a lot of progress on how the money of GCF, GEF, multilateral development banks, as they flow and speed up the transition mainly in developing countries where capital costs are so high, and we need to de-risk these investments for the transition, and a proper smart financial innovative financial mechanisms are required. Also, JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, may be designed in needs-oriented, tailor-made according to the context, can be very helpful and can be also tracked in their process. And finally, we hope we can get away now with a consensus and a fast start of Article 6, and especially paragraph 6.4 can be also a tool. And we need to monitor, report, and verify across these indicators as well. So I think generally this would be my key message. This, of course, has to be complemented by political leadership. We are looking forward very valuable leadership of the COP presidents next year in order to allow that this discussion that started as a climate agreement and is clearly becoming a climate, energy, development, biodiversity discussion to be reflected also on tracking progress and the outcomes of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think you raised so many interesting points there. One of them was this notion of tracking different kinds of indicators, because of course the theory of change in the UNFCCC for so long has been about pressurizing countries to raise targets, which is of course important. But what we're seeing is the targets are getting more ambitious, but the emissions are still going up. So things like your point about addressing the drivers is, I think, very interesting. And of course, in Glasgow, we had this signal of phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, but there's been really no follow-up or tracking. So it'll be interesting to see whether COP28 sends another signal. You also touched on this idea of making the notion of carbon pricing more publicly acceptable. And I think this question of political leadership is important, but also the global stocktake could create the space for the political leaders to lead, which I think is a really important point. So I would like to remind people, if you have questions, please do scan in the QR code, and if you're online, also submit. I have a disappointing lack of questions here, but I have plenty that I could ask myself, but I'd like to hear from the audience. I'd like now to turn to Professor Teng Fei from Tsinghua University. You're really welcome here very much. I think, if I may say, the extent of renewable energy rollout in your country has been quite astonishing when you look at the numbers in terms of the exponential growth in renewables that's really driving this issue globally. I think it's really impressive. I wonder if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share from what you've heard, what you'd like to see coming out of the global stocktake that would help accelerate that growth of renewable energy even further. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for having me, and I agree with a lot of has been said by previous speakers. I will emphasize some of them. I think firstly, it is quite important that to recognize this global stocktake is not only for mitigation, but also for adaptation, technology, and also finance. So its comprehensiveness is quite important. I think this is definitely quite important to understand the context of GST, and also would like to highlight that in fact those elements are interlinked very closely. If we look at firstly from the target that you mentioned and also the emission gap, there are different concepts of emission gap. One of the concept is so-called ambition gap. Another one is the implementation gap. As you have said, that if you look at those net zero commitment has been put by parties. The research shows that net zero commitment will bring us to something like 1.7 degree. That is the target will bring us. But if we look at those real action on table, I mean those credible action which will not bring us to 1.7, but very close to 3 degree, right? So that is the difference between the target and the action. And then let's move to the adaptation. If you are a decision maker in one country and your country is vulnerable to the climate change and you are planning your adaptation, what is the target you are going to consider to plan your adaptation? 1.7 or 3? Probably 3, right? You will not risk your country for the 1.7. So generally that you plan your system based on the implementation instead of the target. And then you will consider how many the adaptive capacity you have. You may have more, you may have less. If you have less, then you probably have a huge amount of residual risk. That is loss and damage, right? So you can enhance your adaptive capacity, but only through international finance and international technology transfer, those kind of means of implementations. But unfortunately, there is not enough finance, as we all know that, right? There is only $100 billion only for mitigation, and there is very few finance for adaptation. The real needs is almost 10 times of the current number. So all things, in fact, are interlinked, and one of the keys to enhance the implementation, not prioritize to raise the ambitions. That is my argument. So I really think that the global stock take is a chance that warners and also askers to carefully consider the very close interlinkage among those different challenges and how to resolve them as a whole. And second issue is I note that the topic today is to accelerating the transition. So we're not only talking about the transition. Transition happens every day, right? Transition happens several decades ago, happens right now. But the challenge is its speed is not enough to bring us to net zero within the limited time. So when we talk about this accelerating, we are not only talking about speed, we are also talking about this wise. I mean, it should cover every dimension of our society instead of not only the energy transition, but also need to cover the development dimension. I mean, I am a lead author together with Emilio in the IPCC report, and my chapter is topic called "To Accelerate the Transition Within the Context of Sustainable Development." So I'll highlight those keywords: the acceleration, the transition, as well as the sustainable development. We should bring all of those keywords together and to identify a solution. We need a holistic approach that to deal with those kind of issues. And also, I'd like to highlight that why this context of sustainable development is important, because as Malta said, when they implement those policies will be implemented within our country. Not only at national level, but also at sub-national level, right? So they are the practitioners in the front of the transition. They are doing the real work. And when they do the real work, that they should take care of a lot of policy objectives, not only the climate one, but also social one, economic one. And we need to identify a solution to help them to bring all of those objectives together and to help them to achieve those objectives as a whole. So that is why the sustainable development context is so much important. Because of that is a tool, that is a container to help us that to engage the national and local policymakers and to bring us together with us and to help them to address those kind of parallel challenge within a package of policy. And also third I would like to mention is the country ownership. And Malta highlight this very much. They see that any solution need to based on the needs from the countries. I think that is also very important. As I have said, that because of generally the entities who implement is the countries, sub-national and also the local business. So we need to understand what they need and to enable us that to accelerate their transition within the context of the development. I think that is also the experience that in China, that why China can achieve this exponential growth of renewables in past decades. I think not only because of this lowering cost of the renewables in China, but also we bring those transition together with the air quality challenge in local communities, and also that to job issues, and also to other very important dimension. That is why the local government and companies buy in this and to develop renewables as a solution. I think that is also the case should be considered that at global level, that we should bring those different policies together and to gain the synergy to maximize the benefit. I think that is how we can move forward. Last but not least, I think that Malta and previous speakers also mentioned importance of cooperation. I think that only through the cooperation we can deliver these objectives of GST, because of the GST is about the collective progress, right? It's not about individual practice. So we should act as a whole. And also, I think that when we consider the solution, we also need to consider how the GST could send a signal to incentivize the cooperation. We should think this carefully. For example, I see that there are target to triple the renewable energy or to double the energy efficiency. I'm thinking hard on whether we can move a step forward that to further incentivize the consideration of cooperation. For example, whether or not we can consider targets such as the global need to come together to further lower the renewable cost by how many percent through cooperation. I think that will incentivize more cooperation among countries. Let's think hard at what kind of things we can do together to lower the cost. It is the lower cost in past decades which drive this exponential growth of renewables in past decades. And we need another decades of further reduce of the cost and to incentivize a triple or even 4 times or 5 times increase of renewables. So let's come together and to think hardly what kind of things we can do. I think that could move further step towards this international cooperation instead of only consider this capacity issues. It will be easily translating to a different country's target, then probably that we will miss that target again. So from that perspective, I totally agree with what has been said, that we need to identify cooperative approach that to move us forward, to accelerate this transition within the context of sustainable development.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I was really struck by a number of things you said. First of all, I'm really happy that you raised the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're actually hosting a panel discussion later during the COP. I might invite you to come to that, but which is specifically on the role of the SDGs in this debate. Because if a country, whether it's actually a developed country or a developing country, if it's serious about its transition to net zero, that's effectively the development blueprint for a country. So I think this distinction between the transition to net zero or climate resilience in the SDGs is completely artificial. It's the same thing. So I think that context that you've mentioned there is really important. And I think one of the things this COP needs to do is really bring the world together more on that. And there was a very interesting report published by the UN this summer, which talks about the synergies between climate and the SDGs. You also anticipated a question that I was going to ask, which is what are the specific signals could the COP give to, which is more specific than just tripling of renewable energy. And you also made really the valid point about the increased focus on the implementation rather than just the target setting. Because as you say, on paper, we're going to go to 1.7, but if you look at the policies in place, we're much above that. So again, I would like to reiterate, if you have questions, please do scan using your phones and ask them, because I still don't have any here. But I have some very good questions I'd like to come back to the panel. So as I say, Juliana and I have been in the negotiating rooms for the last few days, and the status of that room is very different from the conversation we're having here. But one question I'd like to ask, and maybe I'll throw Juliana under the bus first, is if you wanted one particular signal to come out of the global stocktake, something specific that you would like to see that would send a message to the outside world, what might that be? I mean, we've heard from the professor maybe this signal on action to further sort of reduce the price of renewables, because this enhanced international cooperation, I think it's the thing that could be the most transformational thing coming out of the COP. But I fear that unless we have a very clear signal coming out of the COP as to what does that mean, that we may miss this opportunity. So turning to you, Yuli, what would you, if there was one thing you'd like to see coming out of the GST decision on the 12th of December, what would you be looking for first?
I think that's a very difficult question.
That's why that's why I asked you first.
And maybe you were expecting me to say tripling of renewables.
Whichever you...
Which, of course, I think we're very clear in terms of the importance of the energy transition as a transformational one for all countries. But I think that if we frame the GST decision in terms of what science is demanding and for the system transformations that science is demanding from us, every sector should respond accordingly and define its own specific target. So I think that the context and the cross-cutting and the framing of the whole decision in terms of 1.5 and the specific trajectories that are demanded for each specific sector is what we're needing the most. And I feel like at this stage in the negotiations, we don't even have that. In the current iteration of the text, there is a very general language with no specificities on what science is demanding. So I would say that science first, and then the rest, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe that sort of high-level signal reiterating the 1.5 and the science is the biggest signal. Martha, how about you?
Well, maybe following the science, so definitely I think science needs to be driving this, and that has been the nice thing about the GST, right? That the discussions have been so much different than potentially the discussions that are taking place within the negotiations room. So this needs to continue. That's the thing. We've seen it works. What has been discussed within the GST, what we see in the synthesis report, for many, working on science is like, okay, maybe there is that indeed nothing really new because it was in the science, but it's science that now it's officialized here, that is discussed. So how then the just thing is, how do we create the space so that this conversation really continues, but not just for the sake of continuing, but because we have to give a response to what the report said. And the report said that we really need to innovate, for example, in international cooperation. It says other things, that we need to work more holistically in order for countries to be able to be more ambitious and to close the implementation gap. So I think, I don't know the exact words, but there has to be a very clear response from this COP saying, yes, we've heard that. We've heard what it says, the synthesis report, and we're going to do something about it. And it's going to be from 1st of January. Our purpose is, I don't know what kind of series of workshops or etc. I don't know how this can be structured, but that by 24 at least, after 1 year, we can meet in the next COP and we can see coalitions, other communities, conversations across adaptation and mitigation and SDGs maybe together being reported, being discussed in 1 year time in a structured manner so that countries can see how they are part of that revamp of the international ecosystem. Yeah.
What you say is very sensible and logical. Unfortunately, the negotiations are not always like that. So I'm very much hoping they deliver that signal, because at the moment, even referencing the synthesis report is proving controversial, which after 2 years of producing a technical dialogue, it seems bizarre that we can't even mention the synthesis report. But let's see what happens in the end.
And if indeed, because I have the luxury of not indeed
Yeah.
not having to.
Yeah.
But if I'm correct, there is on the way forward specific proposal to say, hey, let's have the dialogue. So okay,
Yeah.
maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need to, but that's already an entry point where maybe we can, then help us moving forward.
Professor Emilio, turning to you, what would you like to read first when you see the decision of COP28?
Well, what I would like to have as an outcome, maybe it's kind of utopic, if I may be provocative, I would like to come, and I think what would be ideally required here would be to have something very concrete showing the world that the oil and gas industry is seriously committed to a transition, and we have evidences and indicators tracking the investments in diversification of oil and gas companies towards renewables. But this, unfortunately, won't happen now, for the moment at least. So more realistically, I would like to have a message that if we are not able to deliver 1.5 degrees as our desired goal, that's not the end of the world, that we can fight for having 0.1 degrees, but the important thing is that no one is left behind, that we are going to do it in a just transition way.
Yeah, important point, and hopefully we do get that strong signal that you mentioned in terms of the transition away from fossil fuels, but we'll see. But that leaving no one behind is also a critical message, and I think the amazing start to this COP of solidarity around not only operationalizing the loss and damage fund, but some of the expectations now is that by the time we leave here, it may have $1 billion in it. It's a good positive signal, but that's important. Professor Fay, what would you like to see in the decision when you first read it?
Well, frankly, I'm not sure, although I also was involved in the negotiations in past years, but I know that it's quite difficult things. And from my perspective, I think that the message should be delivered through this decision should be, okay, this is the collective efforts to stock take what we have been achieved. We recognize that there is a gap, but we all committed that to close this gap. Although we may not have a clear roadmap, but that is our common commitment through the cooperation. I think that signal is quite important. Even the roadmap is clear, because that will send a strong signal that we do agree that to work together to solve this problem, although we are still not quite clear what is the solution. And that will incentivize a lot of cooperation among different stakeholders. I think that is extremely important. And also, I think that we need to emphasize that we understand the key is the implementation, and we will find everything that will enhance the implementation. I think this is also a quite important message, but also it depends on the negotiators in the room to agree or not disagree on that. Yeah. Thank you.
We'll definitely try our best. We, again, if anyone has any questions, please do use the Slido. Otherwise, I'm going to ask one last question, if I may. We have the action agenda, which in the COP has just grown exponentially. I think there's something like over 400,000 people registered for the Green Zone at this COP, of course, many of them online. But we also have multiple initiatives. You have the work of the champions. We have lots of initiatives that have evolved. I'm just wondering, are there any initiatives that you would think you could highlight as being particularly important as a follow-up in the energy transition? So, for example, we have the Race to Zero of the champions. We have things like the International Solar Alliance in India. I don't know if there's particular things that you would like to draw the attention of the audience to that might be a vehicle that could be used for international cooperation in 2024, either around renewable energies or in other areas. I don't know if there's anybody who would like to take that first. Martha? I'm going to throw you under the bus this time.
As it is, right?
Yeah.
Not sure if it qualifies as a coalition, but I think as also a form of international cooperation, maybe a word I think deserves this JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships.
Yeah.
I think it is important to recognize the promise of innovation that they realize. I'm not sure that this promise is delivered, given many difficulties and points we see that could be improved. But overall, they were going, many of the elements that have been an innovation were going into the right direction, especially on being needs-based, but not just country-specific, but country-owned. I'm not saying it was achieved in all the cases, but the direction, I think, was there. And also know that different way of how to think about the scaling up finance for something specific, something concrete, especially on contributing into this learning by doing and capacity, because it's only when you say, okay, you won't get the 1 billion, but you get half tomorrow, another half tomorrow, another half, how are you going to spend each of them? No, that triggers so many questions, even in countries where we know we have so many, we have a lot of analysis, it's good, but still, when you find implementation at the door, knocking at the door, so always further things that need to be solved, and those things unlock and allow us to move forward and understand better the challenge, no? So that we can continue accelerating going forward. So maybe that.
I think that's a really good point. And it strikes me that the JET-P model is one that, if we can get it to work, is actually very transformative. And it's interesting in the context of the tripling of the renewable energy, we're not really hearing about any kind of finance package to go with it, at least not yet. My understanding from the work of Irene is that we need to see essentially a tripling of the investment, more or less, to make that happen. So maybe a signal on that would be interesting. I was wondering if this technology was going to work, but I actually now have 2 questions from the audience. So maybe I can read these out and we can ask if any of the panel. So the first one is, the next global stocktake is only in 2028. So once we finish here, we have another 5 years until the next one. And the question is, shouldn't the discussions be happening on international cooperation on a more continuous basis? So I wonder if anyone has anything to say about that. And then the other one is, could we say a little bit more about the challenges that the global stocktake faces right now? So it's surprising to hear that some countries don't even accept the IPCC conclusions. So I don't know if anybody wants to come in. I have my own views. I'm not sure as a moderator I should be expressing them. But if anybody else would like to come in, Juli, would you like to come in? Or Professor Emilio? Yeah, please.
Yes, I think that there are other fora where this stock take can go on. And we have, of course, the G20. And more there will be interface between trade and climate that are being announced. So again, the WTO has a role also in that. Considering, so I agree completely, we can't just wait until the next GST in 5 years. And in terms of science, well, we've been working with the IPCC for so long. I think it's been a long way. I think it's somehow expected that we have stops and goes, ups and downs, and so on. But I think that more and more, I think the reality is also showing the acuteness of the problem and the sense of urgency and emergence in the climate question is now gaining the public opinion. And I think this battle has to go on. And again, this is counterproductive for the countries that will try to to go against science at this point in time. That's my view. So we should just continue and stress the relevance of alignment and continue to use the IPCC as this very original dialogue to bridge between the political world and the scientific world.
Thank you so much. Professor Fay, would you like to have the last word?
Sure. I think that I agree with the view that next round of global stock take in 2028 that will be a little bit late because of we are fastly consuming our remaining current budget, right? But I also think that we have something need to be done from now on till 2028 because of the global stock take. I think that is stock take of what we have achieved. But as we have discussed, between those global stock take, those 5 years interval, we could focus on how to enhance the implementation. I think that will be a continuous effort, and we need to consider how to use this UN process as a vehicle that to move that forward. I think that will bring us to a more successful global stock take in the next round.
Thank you so much. Sorry, thank you so much. We had one question about what challenges the global stocktake currently facing, and I think the biggest challenge there is that the mandate of the global stocktake is a collective one. So how does a collective process deliver clear signals that cause action at the national level? I think that's one issue. And we've had another question here, which is how are other dynamics at the COP, like loss and damage or just transition, affecting the ambition of the GST outcome? And I think I'll take that because you haven't been in those rooms, but I think the loss and damage outcome at the beginning of the COP certainly created very positive conditions for the rest of the COP. But certainly things like, for example, the global goal on adaptation, which directly links to the global stocktake, that's not going so well at the moment, so that could have an impact on the dynamic. And of course, always is the issue of finance in the background, because every country wants to be more ambitious, but for the vast majority of countries in the world, that ambition is very much limited by the resources which are available. So I think we really need to transition the conversation away from the confrontation on finance, but to see that it's in all of our interests to redirect those investments. So with that, I would really like to thank our esteemed panel. It's really been fantastic to have you, and a great honor to have you all here, especially from the busyness of the COP, and I really wish you all the best. I'd also like to thank very much my team, especially Jennifer, who helped organize this, and then finally to the European Union for giving this space to us, and for the participants here online. Thank you so much. Thank you.